Picture this: 512 houses suddenly sprouting like mushrooms after rain on your family's 47 acres. The HOA president smirks when you ask about the paperwork. Their lawyers were waving thick folders, mocking the naivety of some veteran fresh back from Afghanistan. My hand snatched my father's Colt. That was the moment everything exploded. Oh, they forgot one small detail. I am a staff sergeant with 2 combat tours, 15 years of experience gathering intelligence and tracking down targets. By the way, where are you watching from? Drop your city name in the comments below. I bet your HOA horror stories are just as wild as mine. I stood on Oak Ridge Hill, the same spot where my father used to take me camping every summer. The Texas sun beat down hard, hot and unforgiving as always, but the view had changed. Instead of the endless green pastures that had belonged to the Mercer family since 1952, I saw rows upon rows of identical houses stretching across the valley. Red tile roofs glint in the afternoon light, manicured lawns behind white picket fences. Crestwood Heights, the welcome sign declared, a premier living community. I had been gone 15 years, fighting wars in places most Americans could not find on a map. In that time, someone had built an entire city on my grandfather's sweat, and my father had died 6 months ago without ever telling me a thing about it. My fingers tightened around the wooden grip of his Colt 1911, not because I intended to shoot anyone. This pistol was simply the only thing Dad left me, tucked inside an oak box alongside the land documents I had come home to collect. Robert Mercer, stubborn until the very end, battled stage 4 pancreatic cancer alone while I finished my last deployment. He never once asked me to come home. The Army gave me an honorable discharge, and I drove straight from Fort Hood, expecting to find an empty farmhouse and decades of memories. Instead, I found this nightmare painted in suburban pastels. My phone buzzed. A notification from Crestwood Heights HOA. Dear Mr. Mercer, you have 72 hours to vacate the temporary structure on HOA-managed property. Failure to comply will result in forced removal pursuant to Section 4.7 of the CC&Rs. I read it 3 times. The words refused to make sense. The county recorder's office smelled like dust and stale coffee. A government building frozen somewhere in the 1980s. I asked the clerk for deed records on the Mercer property along County Road 17. She typed into her computer, frowned, then told me the parcel had been legally transferred to the Crestwood Heights Development Authority in September 2019. Purchase price $1.2 million. Something cold settled in my chest. September 2019. Dad was alive then, but selling this land was the one thing he swore he would never do. That land is the backbone of the Mercer name. Son, he used to say, do not ever let them take it. I asked to see the deed itself. The clerk printed a copy and slid it across the counter. There was a signature at the bottom. Robert A. Mercer. I stared at those 3 words until my vision blurred. My father's handwriting had always been sharp and angular, the precise penmanship of a man who spent 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. Every letter pointed like a blade, but this signature was soft, rounded, almost feminine. The loops curved where his hand would have cut straight lines. My stomach dropped. Someone had forged his name. I knew it the same way I knew how to breathe. The attached survey map caught my eye next, and another detail jumped out at me. The northeast corner looked wrong somehow. My grandfather had dug a stone well there back in '52, a landmark for 3 generations of Mercers. I had played around that well as a child, dropped pennies into its dark water, and made wishes. Now that entire section was missing from the plot, just erased, as if it had never existed. I drove back to the cabin as sunset bled red and orange across the horizon. The Colt went on the kitchen table. I sat across from it, watching the last light glint off its barrel. Dad always told me a gun was the last resort. Before that, you use your head. He was right. Bullets could not fix forged documents or missing property lines, but information could. Evidence could. I opened my laptop and typed how to verify title deed legitimacy. Texas into the search bar. The results loaded slowly on the weak rural connection, each second stretching longer than it should. Outside, construction equipment hummed from the development. machines still grinding away in the darkness. Someone had made a fortune building on this land, roughly $285,000 per unit. If the market estimates were accurate, that was a lot of money, a lot of motive. I leaned back in the chair and thought about what I knew so far. A forged signature, a manipulated survey map, a seal that never happened. The pieces floated in my mind like fragments of a reconnaissance report, waiting to be assembled into something coherent. But I was missing too many variables. Who had access to forge the deed? Why was the old well location removed from the map? And why had nobody told me any of this while Dad was still alive? The questions circled endlessly. Predators waiting for weakness. I rubbed my eyes and checked the time. Almost 7 p.m. That was when my phone buzzed again with a text from an unknown number. The message was short, just 2 lines that made my pulse spike. Meet me at Dusty Trail Coffee, 7 p.m. I know about your land. It was signed with 2 initials, T. B. Dusty Trail. Coffee sat nearly empty when I pushed through the door at 7 p.m. A few truckers in the corner. A waitress is wiping tables. No one who looked like they carried secrets about stolen property. I ordered black coffee and waited. The minutes crawled past. 7:15, 7:30. By 8 p.m., no one had approached my table. TB either got cold feet or someone warned them off. I dropped a $5 bill next to my empty mug and left. The mystery contact would have to wait. Tomorrow morning, I was heading straight to the source, the HOA office at Crestwood Heights. If Regina Whitmore wanted to play games with forged deeds and manipulated maps, she could explain it to my face. The building sat at the development entrance, all glass and steel, completely out of place against the Texas scrubland. I walked in at 9 a.m. and told the receptionist I needed whoever was in charge. She made a hushed phone call, then pointed me down a hallway lined with photos of smiling homeowners. Every staged grin felt like a taunt. At the end of the corridor, a door swung open. Regina Whitmore emerged, silver hair in a tight bun, gray blazer over cream silk, a smile cold enough to freeze the August heat. She extended her hand and introduced herself as the HOA president, inviting me in like we were about to discuss property taxes over tea. I ignored the handshake and sat across from her mahogany desk. I gave her my name and told her I wanted to know how 512 houses ended up on the Mercer land. Her smile stayed frozen in place. She folded her hands and spoke slowly, the way adults talk to children throwing tantrums. Mr. Mercer, grief can cloud judgment, she said, but paperwork does not lie. Your father sold in September 2019 for $1.2 million. Completely legal. I watched her eyes as she spoke. Steady. Practiced. This was a script she had rehearsed. I mentioned my father's VA medical coverage. No out-of-pocket costs for his cancer treatment. No reason to sell. Regina's gaze flickered toward a filing cabinet in the corner, just for a half second, before snapping back to me. That tiny flinch told me plenty. She was sitting on something she did not want me to find. I asked to see the original transaction documents. She paused, then called her assistant. 20 minutes later, a stack of papers landed on her desk. 200 pages thick. The CC&Rs of Crestwood Heights, she explained, flipping to bookmarked sections. Section 4.7. Any pre-annexation structure must be removed within 90 days or face $500 daily penalties. Section 12.3. Boundary disputes must be filed within 30 days of annexation. After that, claims are permanently forfeit. I asked when annexation occurred. October 2019, she said, satisfaction creeping into her voice. You are 5 years past the deadline. There is nothing left to dispute. I let her words hang in the air while I turned pages until I found the deed transfer, the forged signature, and beneath it, a black rectangle covering the notary section completely. I pointed at the redaction and asked why the notary was hidden. Her smile tightened by a fraction. Privacy regulations, she replied. Texas Property Code. Want it unsealed. Get a court order. I filed that away. Whoever notarized this fraud was a thread worth pulling. But something else caught my attention as I scanned the document more carefully. The deed listed the property as 12 acres, not 47. 35 acres had simply vanished from the official record. I looked up and saw something shift behind Regina's eyes. A flicker of awareness. She knew I had spotted the discrepancy. and she knew this was not going to end with a polite handshake and a drive back home. I left the building with the documents clutched against my chest. The parking lot shimmered with heat waves rising off the asphalt, distorting the rows of identical houses beyond the gate. Each one represented a piece of my family's legacy, sliced up and sold to strangers. I sat in my truck for a long moment, engine off, staring at the development that should not exist. The rage in my chest was a living thing, coiling tighter with every breath. But rage alone would not win this fight. I needed facts, evidence, a paper trail that could not be denied. I started the engine and drove toward the edge of town, past the water tower, past the old feed store, until the iron gates of Maplewood Cemetery appeared through my windshield. My father's grave was near the veterans section, under a sprawling oak tree that had probably been standing since before Texas was a state. The headstone still looked too new, too white, against the yellowed grass. I stood there with my hands in my pockets, not sure what to say. "Dad," I finally muttered, "did you really sell it? Or did they take it while you were too sick to fight back?" The oak leaves rustled overhead. No answer came. I thought about everything I had uncovered in 48 hours. A signature that was not his. Boundaries redrawn to erase 35 acres. A notary hidden behind black ink. An annexation timed perfectly while I was deployed overseas, and he was dying alone. None of it smelled like a legitimate sale. All of it pointed to something far darker. And Regina Whitmore sat right at the center of the web. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Same unknown number. Different message. I waited last night. The text read, "Too many eyes. Meet me at the old grain silo on Route 7. Tomorrow, at 6 a.m. Come alone. I have proof they changed the maps." It was signed TB. I stared at those two initials until the screen dimmed. Whoever this person was, they knew something important enough to risk a secret meeting. Important enough that showing up at a public coffee shop had spooked them. I typed a single-word reply and hit send. Confirmed. Tomorrow at dawn. I would finally get some answers, or I would walk into a trap either way. Standing still was no longer an option. The old grain silo on Route 7 stood like a rusted skeleton against the pre-dawn sky. I arrived at 5:45 a.m., parked behind a collapsed feed shed, and waited with the engine off. The Colt sat in my glove compartment. Bringing it had crossed my mind, but I decided against it. If this were an ambush, a pistol would not help against multiple attackers. If it were legitimate, showing up armed would spook my only lead. At exactly 6 a.m., a battered pickup rattled down the dirt road and stopped alongside mine. The driver was an older man, late 60s, with thick glasses magnifying his watery blue eyes. He climbed out slowly, joints creaking, and extended a weathered hand. "Ted Brennan," he said. "Sorry about the coffee shop. Too many people report back to her." I shook his hand and asked who he meant. "Regina Whitmore," he replied, glancing around like the cornstalks might be listening. "I worked at the county recorder's office for 35 years before retiring in 2018. I remember every major land file in this county. The Mercer property never changed hands once in all my time there. Not until after I left." My jaw tightened. "The sale in 2019, I said. Ted nodded grimly. "It was entered into the system by my replacement, Eleanor Whitmore, the HOA president's daughter." The weight of that revelation settled into my chest. Regina's own daughter had input the fraudulent deed. This was not an outside scam or bureaucratic error. This was family business, conducted from inside the county office itself. Ted reached into his truck and pulled out a rolled tube of paper, yellowed with age. He unfurled it across the hood. "Professional paranoia," he explained. "I kept copies. This is the original survey from '52. I studied the faded lines, the handwritten notations, the clear boundary markers. The northeast corner showed the old stone well exactly where I remembered it from childhood. Everything matched the land I had grown up hearing stories about." Then Ted laid a second map beside it, printed on fresh white paper. "The current HOA survey," he said quietly. I leaned closer. The boundaries had shifted, not by inches, but by hundreds of feet. The entire eastern property line had moved approximately 800 feet west, swallowing a massive section into Crestwood Heights territory. Someone had literally redrawn my family off the map. I stared at those two documents side by side, the original and the forgery, and felt something cold crystallize in my gut. This was not a mistake. This was calculated theft executed with precision and patience. Ted watched me process the information, then spoke again, his voice dropping lower. There is something else you need to know. In 2017, a company called Whitmore Development LLC commissioned a geological survey of this area. I saw the report before it disappeared from the files. They found something under your land, a massive deposit of calciumite ore. The surveyor estimated its value at $127 million in extraction rights over 50 years. The number hit me like a mortar round. 127 million. I gripped the edge of the truck bed to steady myself. Suddenly, every piece of this nightmare clicked into place with sickening clarity. Regina had not stolen my land to build houses. The 512 homes were camouflaged, a legitimate-looking development to justify her control of the property. What she really wanted lay beneath the surface. Mineral rights are worth more than most people would see in 1,000 lifetimes. My father had died on land, sitting atop a fortune he never knew existed, while I was fighting wars on the other side of the planet, and Regina had orchestrated everything from her glass and steel office, smiling her cold smile, waiting for the last Mercer to either give up or be crushed. I rolled up both maps carefully, securing them like the weapons they were. The morning sun was climbing now, burning off the mist that clung to the fields. I thanked Ted and asked if there was anyone else who might have evidence. The geologist, he said. Dr. Samuel Harrington. He refused to alter his findings when they pressured him, so they buried the report and ran him out of town. Last I heard, he was living in Austin. I drove back to the cabin with Ted's maps secured on the passenger seat, my mind sorting through implications with cold tactical focus. Forged signatures, manipulated county records, a hidden geological fortune. This was organized fraud with a suburban facade, and I was only beginning to see its full scope. When I pulled up to the cabin, 3 envelopes waited in my mailbox. I opened them standing in the gravel driveway, the Texas sun already baking my shoulders. The first was from First National Bank of Maplewood. My mortgage was being called in immediately, $45,000. 30 days to pay in full or face foreclosure. The second bore the sheriff's letterhead, a formal inspection notice for suspected building code violations, scheduled for tomorrow morning. The third message arrived by email while I stood there holding the paper threats from Henderson and Associates, attorneys representing Crestwood Heights HOA, 48 hours to vacate or face legal action for trespassing on HOA-managed property. I lowered the phone and looked out at the development gleaming in the distance. Bank, sheriff, lawyers. 3 separate attacks from 3 separate angles, all landing within the same 24-hour window. This was not a coincidence. This was coordinated suppression. I had seen this playbook in military operations. Overwhelm the target from multiple directions until they either surrender or make a fatal mistake. But Regina had miscalculated. She assumed I was just another grieving civilian who would crumble under pressure. She did not know I had spent 15 years learning to stay calm when everything around me was designed to break me. I called Ted that evening from the cabin porch, watching the sunset bleed red across the horizon. He listened to my rundown of the coordinated attacks without interruption. That is how she operates, he said finally. Regina has spent a decade building connections. The bank president, the sheriff's department, even the county judge. Favors and obligations are woven through every institution in this town. I asked if Dr. Harrington could be trusted. Ted was quiet for a moment. He lost his career because he refused to lie for her. If anyone has proof of what lies under that land, it is him. I wrote down the name and the city. Dr. Samuel Harrington, Austin, tomorrow. I will face a bank demanding impossible payment, a sheriff searching for phantom violations, and lawyers threatening me with trespassing charges on my own family's property. But before any of that, I needed to reach the one man who could explain exactly why Regina Whitmore was willing to commit multiple felonies for 47 acres of Texas dirt, 127 million reasons, buried under Mercer soil. The third night after my return, I woke to the sound of metal scraping against metal. 2:14 a.m. according to the clock on my nightstand. The cabin was dark, but moonlight filtered through the curtains enough for me to see my own breath in the cold air. I lay still, listening. Another scrape, then a soft thud. The sounds were coming from outside, near where I had parked my truck. Combat instincts honed over 15 years kicked in without conscious thought. I rolled out of bed silently, grabbed the Colt from beneath my pillow, and moved toward the window in a low crouch, through the dusty glass. I saw two dark figures hunched over my truck. One was working on the passenger door with a pry bar. The other stood watch, head swiveling like a nervous bird, scanning for threats. I slipped out the back door and circled the cabin, using every shadow and piece of cover the way I had been trained. The night air cut sharply against my bare arms. I came up behind them at an angle, close enough to see they were both wearing black ski masks. The one with the pry bar had gotten the door open and was reaching inside. I raised the Colt and shouted for them to freeze. Both figures spun around, caught in the moonlight. For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Then they bolted. I let them run, watching as they disappeared beyond the tree line. Discharging a weapon would only complicate things with local law enforcement. Their footsteps faded into silence. I lowered the pistol and walked to my truck, already knowing something was wrong. The passenger door hung open at an ugly angle. On the seat, my father's oak box lay broken, its brass hinges torn loose. I had moved it from the cabin the previous day, thinking it would be safer in a locked vehicle. Empty. Every document inside was gone. The realization hit me harder than any bullet ever had. They had not come for valuables or the Colt I kept beside my bed. They had come specifically for paper, for evidence. Someone knew exactly what I had and where I kept it, which meant someone was watching. The break-in was not random theft. It was a surgical strike designed to leave me with nothing but my word against theirs. I stood in the cold darkness, staring at the shattered box, understanding that this fight had just escalated beyond anything I had anticipated. I called the sheriff's department at first light. Deputy cars arrived within the hour, but Sheriff Dale Prescott himself showed up 30 minutes later, coffee cup in hand. Looking more annoyed than concerned, he examined the broken truck door, glanced at the empty oak box, and asked if I was certain I had locked the vehicle. His tone suggested I was wasting his time. I told him 2 masked intruders had stolen irreplaceable family documents. He shrugged, like I had reported a missing garden ornament. Probably just kids looking for valuables, he said. You sure you did not misplace those papers somewhere? I watched his face carefully, looking for any crack in the performance. Then his gaze drifted past me to the cabin, and something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, memory, something personal he was trying to suppress. I asked if he had known my father. Sheriff Prescott went still. Robert Mercer was a good man, he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. That is all I will say. Then he walked back to his cruiser, without another word. The deputies finished their perfunctory investigation and left shortly after, promising a report we both knew would go nowhere. I stood in the driveway watching the dust settle, filing away what I had observed. The sheriff was compromised, but that flicker when he looked at the cabin suggested history he was choosing not to share. Useful information, but not immediately actionable. Right now, I have bigger problems than a conflicted lawman with buried loyalties. My phone rang at 9:47 a.m. Unknown number. I answered and heard a woman's voice, young and trembling. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "I cannot talk long. This is Eleanor Whitmore." My pulse spiked. Before I could respond, she continued in a rushed whisper. "Find the payment records for the notary in 2019. $15,000. That is not a standard fee." The line clicked dead. I stared at the phone, processing what had just happened. Eleanor was scared of her own mother, and she had just pointed me toward financial evidence that could unravel the entire conspiracy. A standard notary fee in Texas was around $50. $15,000 meant the notary had been paid to commit fraud. That was bribery, forgery, and conspiracy wrapped into one paper trail. I spent the afternoon at the Maplewood Public Library, researching federal property fraud statutes on their computer terminals. Title 18, United States Code, Section 10-14, Bank and Real Estate Fraud, maximum penalty of 30 years imprisonment and $1 million in fines. This was not a civil matter anymore. Local authorities were either complicit or compromised. I drafted a formal complaint to the FBI field office in Houston, keeping it tight and factual. Forged deed, manipulated survey, document theft, coordinated harassment from local institutions. I attached copies of Ted's original maps and hit send. The weight of what I had just done settled over me, like body armor. There was no turning back now. I had escalated this to the federal level, and Regina Whitmore would eventually find out. That night, I sat on the cabin porch as the sun bled out below the horizon. The Colt rested on the table beside me, untouched. 3 days ago, I had come home expecting to inherit an empty farmhouse and some acreage. Instead, I had walked into a conspiracy involving forged documents, stolen mineral rights, masked intruders, and a network of corruption reaching into every local institution. The pressure was mounting from every direction. The bank is threatening foreclosure, sheriff looking for violations, lawyers demanding eviction, and somewhere out there, people are willing to break into my truck in the dead of night to destroy evidence. I opened my laptop and started organizing everything into a timeline. Facts, dates, names, connections. Somewhere in Houston, my FBI complaint was sitting in an inbox. And somewhere in Austin, a geologist named Samuel Harrington held proof that could explain why Regina Whitmore was willing to commit multiple felonies for this land. Tomorrow I will find him. Tonight, I will prepare. The drive to Austin took 3 hours through flat Texas landscape that blurred past my windows like a fever dream. I had tracked down Dr. Samuel Harrington through public records, finding an address in a quiet neighborhood on the city's east side. When I pulled up to his modest brick house at 11 a.m., I half expected him to refuse to see me. Ted had warned me the geologist was skittish, traumatized by whatever pressure had driven him out of the industry. But when I knocked and introduced myself as Robert Mercer's son, something shifted in his weathered face. He studied me for a long moment, then stepped aside. The living room was cluttered with geological maps and academic journals, the workspace of a scientist who had never stopped thinking about the case that ended his career. Dr. Harrington was 65 years old, with a gray beard and tired eyes that had seen too much compromise. He offered me coffee and sat across from me in a worn leather chair. In 2017, he began without preamble. Whitmore Development hired me for a geological survey near County Road 17. What I found beneath your family's land was one of the largest calciumite deposits in the state. When they saw the value, they asked me to redraw the boundaries, to shift the deposit location onto land that would fall under their development authority. I refused. My contract was terminated within 24 hours. The report vanished from county files. Within 2 months, I was unemployable anywhere in Texas. He set down his coffee and reached into a drawer, pulling out a small black USB drive. I kept a backup. This contains my original report with accurate boundaries and extraction projections. It proves exactly what lies beneath your property. I took the drive and turned it over in my fingers, feeling the weight of evidence that could not be dismissed. But another thought pushed forward as I sat there. 512 houses now stood on that land. Over 1,500 people lived in them. Families who had bought homes without knowing anything about forged deeds or mineral rights. If I won this fight, what happened to them? My father used to say there was a difference between fighting because you were afraid and fighting. After all, it was right. Those families were not my enemies. They were victims. Same like me. I would find a way to make sure they did not pay for Regina's crimes. I thanked Dr. Harrington and stood to leave, securing the USB in my jacket pocket. He walked me to the door and paused with his hand on the frame. "Your father was a good man," he said quietly. "I never met him, but I heard stories. He deserved better than what they did to his legacy." I drove back toward Maplewood as the sun began its descent, the sky shifting through shades of amber and rust. The flat highway stretched endlessly ahead, giving me time to process everything Harrington had shared. His words echoed in my mind, mixing with the hum of tires on asphalt. By the time I reached the cabin, twilight had settled over the hills like a bruise. My phone buzzed with an email notification as I stepped out of the truck. FBI Field Office, Houston. They had received my complaint and opened a preliminary investigation. More importantly, they had attached the document I had requested, Payment records for the notary who allegedly witnessed my father's signature. I scrolled through the financial data on my phone screen. Leaning against the truck, as crickets began their nightly chorus, Martha Caldwell, notary public, had received a wire transfer of $15,000 from Whitmore Development LLC on September 16, 2019, one day after the supposed deed signing. Standard fees ran around $50. $15,000 meant only one thing. The notary had been bribed to certify a fraudulent signature. I dug deeper into the attachment and found another detail. Martha Caldwell had passed away in January 2020, just 4 months after the transaction. Natural causes, according to the death certificate. Convenient timing for someone who might have been pressured to testify about what really happened. But the crucial piece was buried further in the FBI documents. Hospital admission records from the VA Medical Center, Dallas. Robert Mercer, admitted September 10, 2019, for emergency cardiac surgery. Discharged September 25th. The deed claimed my father had signed in Maplewood on September 15th. He was lying in a hospital bed 180 miles away, recovering from open heart surgery. On the exact date, Regina claimed he sold his legacy. Physically impossible. The signature was not just forged. The entire transaction was fabricated from nothing, constructed by someone with county access and enough money to buy silence. I had verifiable, legally admissible proof that the deed was fraudulent. I sat on the cabin porch as full darkness settled over the Texas hills, organizing everything in my mind. Ted's maps prove boundary manipulation. Harrington's geological data documenting the deposit. FBI records showing the bribery payment. Hospital records proving my father's alibi. Each piece interlocked, forming a picture of systematic fraud spanning years and involving multiple conspirators. But paper evidence could be challenged by expensive lawyers. Dismissed. Reinterpreted. What I needed was a voice. Someone who had witnessed the crimes and was willing to speak publicly. My phone sat on the table. Eleanor's number saved from her call. She had already risked reaching out once. The question was whether she was ready to risk everything. I picked up the phone and typed a message, choosing each word carefully. I have proof that your mother committed federal crimes. Hospital records. Payment records. Geological surveys. The only thing missing is a witness. You know what she did. You helped enter the data. The question is whether you want to spend 30 years in federal prison for her sake, or whether you want to help me end this. I hit send and set the phone down, watching the screen go dark. The development glittered in the distance. Hundreds of windows lit against the night. 1,500 people living their lives on stolen ground, oblivious to the crimes that had made their neighborhood possible. 3 minutes passed, then 5. My phone buzzed. Eleanor's reply was 2 words that shifted the entire battlefield. I will testify. I stared at those 3 simple words until the screen dimmed again. A daughter willing to betray her mother for the sake of truth. A witness who could connect every piece of evidence to the woman at the center of the conspiracy. Tomorrow, I will contact the FBI and request that they interview Eleanor before Regina discovers her betrayal. Tonight, I would let myself feel something I had not allowed since coming home. Hope. Real. Dangerous. Fragile hope that justice might actually be possible. The federal courthouse in Houston rose like a monument to justice against the gray morning sky. I arrived at 8:30 a.m., dressed in the only suit I owned, the one I had worn to my father's funeral 6 months ago. The building's marble halls echoed with footsteps and hushed conversations as I made my way to courtroom 4. Today was the preliminary hearing to determine whether sufficient evidence existed to pursue criminal charges against Regina Whitmore. The prosecution had assembled everything into a single devastating case file. Maps, geological data, financial records, hospital documents, and most importantly, Eleanor Whitmore, who sat in a witness room somewhere in this building, waiting to testify against her own mother. I took my seat in the front row behind the prosecution table, next to Andrew Blackwell, the federal attorney assigned to the case. He was a sharp-faced man in his 50s, with gray temples and the calm demeanor of someone who had prosecuted white-collar criminals for decades. Across the aisle, Regina Whitmore sat beside 3 lawyers in expensive suits. She wore a cream-colored blazer, silver hair perfectly arranged, When our eyes met, she offered me a small smile that promised nothing but contempt. She still believed she would walk out of here untouched. That certainty in her expression only hardened my resolve. Judge Patricia Hernandez called the proceedings to order at 9 a.m. sharp. The federal prosecutor walked the court through the evidence methodically. Forged deed, manipulated boundaries, bribery payment to a deceased notary. Hospital records prove my father could not have signed anything in Maplewood while recovering from cardiac surgery in Dallas. Each piece landed like a hammer blow. Regina's lawyers objected repeatedly, but the judge overruled them with increasing impatience. The paper trail was simply too overwhelming. I watched Regina's composure flicker for the first time, a tiny crack in the porcelain mask she wore so expertly. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The prosecutor called Eleanor Whitmore to the stand. The courtroom doors opened, and Regina's daughter walked in carrying a black briefcase. She looked pale but determined, refusing to meet her mother's gaze. Regina half rose from her seat. "Eleanor," she hissed, "what are you doing?" Her lawyers pulled her back down, whispering urgently. Eleanor took the oath and sat with her hands folded. She stated her name and former position at the county recorder's office for the record, then confirmed she had entered falsified data under her mother's instruction. "I knew the signature was forged," she said steadily. "I knew the boundaries had been manipulated." She opened the briefcase and pulled out a portable hard drive. "This contains 3 years of recorded conversations. Everything is time-stamped and verified." The courtroom erupted. Judge Hernandez pounded her gavel and restored order, then allowed the recordings as evidence. The first audio clip played through the speakers. Regina's voice filled the room, unmistakable. "The Mercer land has to be ours before the old man dies. If we need to create paperwork, we create paperwork." Another voice asked about the son in Afghanistan. Regina laughed. "A soldier. He will probably die over there. And if he does not, we will handle him when the time comes." The words hit me like shrapnel. I sat frozen, hearing a woman casually discuss my death as a minor inconvenience to her business plans. My father had died alone while this woman plotted to steal everything he had built. Rage coiled in my chest, cold and patient. Eleanor continued, revealing the detail that shifted everything. The proceeds from the development had not gone into the company accounts, as reported. $94 million had been wire transferred to a private account in the Cayman Islands, registered under her mother's name. Not property fraud alone, international money laundering. The prosecutor introduced bank statements and transfer confirmations corroborating her testimony. The evidence was irrefutable. Regina's mask finally shattered. She stared at her daughter with naked hatred, gripping the defense table until her knuckles turned white. For the first time since I had met her, she looked like what she truly was. A cornered predator realizes the trap has already closed. The prosecutor presented one final piece of evidence, a photograph of the original boundary marker Harold Mercer had placed in 1952, showing the date, March 15th, carved into stone. "This marker," he explained, "was recently discovered beneath the foundation of house number 247 in Crestwood Heights, physical proof that the development was constructed on property never legally transferred." The judge studied the photograph carefully, then looked at Regina. Based on the evidence presented, she announced, "This court finds sufficient grounds to proceed with criminal prosecution. The defendant will be remanded into federal custody pending trial on charges of real estate fraud, forgery, bribery, and money laundering." Federal marshals approached with handcuffs. As they secured her wrists, Regina turned and locked eyes with me. "You think you have won," she said, voice dripping with venom. "That land will never be yours. Those houses are not going anywhere. You have destroyed nothing." I met her gaze without flinching. "The land was always mine," I replied. "You just made the mistake of thinking paper could erase that." They led her away through a side door, expensive heels clicking against marble. The sound echoed long after she disappeared. I remained in my seat as the courtroom slowly emptied, letting the weight of the moment settle. This was not a victory yet. The trial would take months, maybe longer, but for the first time since returning home, I could see the path to justice clearly, and I intended to walk it all the way to the end. 3 months passed between the preliminary hearing and the federal trial. In that time, The case against Regina Whitmore metastasized into something far larger than one woman's crimes. FBI investigators followed the threads Eleanor had provided, unraveling corruption at every level. 3 HOA board members arrested for conspiracy. The county clerk who replaced Ted was indicted for falsifying records. First National Bank is facing federal investigation. The empire Regina had spent a decade building was collapsing piece by piece, and every headline brought news of another arrest, another subpoena, another pillar crumbling into dust. The trial took place in the same Houston courtroom. I sat in the front row every single day, watching as witness after witness dismantled Regina's defense. Ted Brennan testified about the original records and systematic manipulation after his retirement. Dr. Harrington presented his geological report, explaining how mineral deposit boundaries had been redrawn to strip my family of extraction rights. Then Sheriff Dale Prescott took the stand and produced something that made my breath catch. A handwritten letter from my father, dated August 2018, was entrusted to the sheriff for safekeeping. If anything happens to me, my father had written, help my son protect what is his. I stared at those words in my father's angular handwriting, feeling his presence in the courtroom like a hand on my shoulder. 6 years the sheriff had carried that letter, waiting for the moment when it would matter. On the final day of testimony, Regina asked to address the court. Her lawyers tried to stop her, but she waved them off. She stood at the defendant's table, looking smaller than I remembered, the arrogance stripped away by weeks of damning evidence. Judge Hernandez asked if she understood she was speaking under oath. Regina nodded and began. I wanted to be rich, she said flatly. That is all. I saw an opportunity, and I took it. Robert Mercer was dying. His son was overseas. The land was sitting there with a fortune underneath, and nobody was paying attention. So I created the paperwork. I paid the notary. Everything they said is true. The courtroom fell silent. Her lawyers sat frozen, watching their client confess in front of a packed gallery and television cameras. She turned and looked directly at me. I underestimated you. Mr. Mercer, your father raised a stubborn son. I held her gaze without responding. There was nothing left to say. She had just destroyed herself more thoroughly than any prosecutor ever could. The confession echoed through the silent courtroom. A woman finally stripped of every mask and justification, standing naked before the consequences she had spent years believing would never find her. Judge Hernandez delivered the sentence 2 weeks later. 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 15. Full restitution for the mineral rights she had attempted to steal. Her co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, depending on involvement. The county clerk got 7 years. The news coverage was relentless. CNN ran the story for 3 consecutive nights. National newspapers published detailed accounts of how a suburban HOA had become a front for organized fraud. Regina's face appeared on screens across the country, the image of corruption exposed and punished. The court declared me the rightful owner of the Mercer property, including the land beneath Crestwood Heights. But I had thought long and hard about what to do with that ownership. Those families had purchased their homes in good faith. They had no idea the development was built on stolen ground. Punishing them would make me no better than Regina. I worked with federal attorneys to establish a just solution. Residents could remain under long-term lease agreements at fair market rates. Mineral extraction rights would be managed through a trust, with proceeds split between community development and compensation for fraud victims. It was not perfect, but it honored what my father would have wanted. The evening after final sentencing, I drove back to Maplewood as the sun set behind me. The cabin waited, quiet and solid, exactly as my father had built it. I sat on the porch with a beer, watching lights flicker on across the valley. Those families would keep their homes. Justice had been served without creating new victims, somewhere beneath those foundations. My grandfather's boundary marker from 1952 remained buried, silent witness to everything that had happened and everything that had been set right. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Thank you for not hating me," she wrote. "I am trying to be someone my grandfather would have been proud of. I understood that desire better than anyone. The weight of family legacy. The need to honor those who came before us. I typed back a simple reply. We both are. The stars emerged slowly as full darkness settled over the Texas hills. I thought about my father, lying in that Dallas hospital, fighting for his life while Regina orchestrated her theft. I thought about the years I had spent overseas, unaware of what was happening to everything he had worked to protect. And I thought about the strange path that had brought me here, to this porch, with justice finally delivered and the Mercer name restored. My father's letter sat folded in my pocket, the paper soft from being read too many times. Help my son protect what is his. I had done that, against lawyers and corrupt officials, and a woman who had underestimated what a stubborn soldier could accomplish with evidence and patience. Tomorrow I will begin the work of rebuilding. Tonight, I let myself rest. 6 months after the trial, I stood beside the old stone well my grandfather had dug in 1952. The construction crews had carefully excavated it from beneath house number 247, restoring it to its original location on the northeast corner of the Mercer property. The homeowners had been understanding, even supportive, once they learned the full story. Today, the well stood surrounded by freshly planted oak trees, the centerpiece of a small memorial park that would bear my father's name. Robert Mercer Community Park, a place where the families of Crestwood Heights could gather, never forgetting the truth of how this land had almost been stolen. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my father's Colt 1911, the pistol that had started this journey, the weapon I had grabbed in that first moment of rage when I saw what had been built on Mercer soil. I had not fired it once. I never needed to. Justice had come through evidence and patience, through allies like Ted and Dr. Harrington, through Eleanor's courage to testify against her own mother. The gun had served its purpose simply by reminding me of my father's wisdom. A firearm is the last resort. Before that, you use your head. I knelt beside the well and placed the Colt into a wooden box along with a photograph of my father standing next to the original boundary marker. Then I buried them both in the soft Texas earth. The Mercer Legacy Fund was operational now, distributing its first grants to families affected by HOA fraud across the state. Eleanor served on the advisory board, working to rebuild her reputation through genuine service. Sheriff Prescott had retired quietly, his conscience finally clear after delivering my father's letter, and somewhere, in a federal prison, Regina Whitmore was beginning her 25-year sentence, stripped of everything she had schemed to possess. I stood and brushed the dirt from my hands, looking out across the valley where 512 families lived, in homes built on stolen ground that was now shared ground. My father would have approved. Legacy was not about hoarding what belonged to you. It was about protecting it for everyone who came after. Justice does not require violence. It requires patience, evidence, and the courage to stand alone against a corrupt system. Regina Whitmore thought power meant controlling institutions. She learned that true power belongs to those who refuse to surrender their dignity. If this story resonated with you, support Karma Neighbors by liking and subscribing. Share your own HOA battles in the comments. Your story might be next.